Dude, you gotta stop hating on Orion. I feel like I can bring a unique perspective to Orion because, unlike most people, Orion was my first Giga coaster. And since then, I've actually been on the other three American Gigas. It's been interesting to compare it from like a reverse perspective in that I got to ride Orion first and then Millennium, Fury, and Intimidator afterwards. Jumping right into Orion, just like Diamondback, the presentation is spectacular, which I think is credit to Kings Island. It's a spectacular park and it's very well run, and it makes sure that all of its rides are presented perfectly, especially its headliners like Orion and Diamondback. Orion's station is really nice, and it actually has a themed queue house, which is pretty rare for a regional theme park or a regional amusement park. It's not much, but it is pretty good. I feel that the name Orion and the logo are inferior to Diamondback, but the imposing structure of the ride itself and the superior integration into the themed land, which is Area 72, I feel like that makes up for it. So once again, the presentation is spectacular. For the ride itself, Orion has the same restraints as Diamondback, which I love. If you've watched my Diamondback review, you would know that. Clamshells are my absolute favorite restraints, and I'm so happy that my first Giga had them. I didn't notice any differences in terms of restraints, but however, I do prefer the freedom of the staggered seats on Diamondback and the longer trains. But I can't complain about Orion. It's still a spectacular setup. The lift hill is very long. You have a great view of the surrounding area. It's also very quiet, which has been talked about. On my first ride on Orion, I was a little disappointed by the first drop because I was expecting it to have stronger airtime than Diamondbacks, which I didn't feel it did. The more I rode it, the more it grew on me, and I later switched that opinion. But at first, I wasn't that impressed with it. I mean, it's obvious that the duration of the drop and the sustained airtime is very impressive, but at first, I wasn't the biggest fan of the drop. I have since changed that opinion. After getting multiple re-rides on Orion, I realized how spectacular and world class that drop is. It is amazing, don't get me wrong. After you kick things off with a bang with that first drop, the next two elements are pretty underwhelming, which is really disappointing. The wave turn is it's okay. If you're in the far right seat on the wave turn, you might get some light floater. I remember getting that on most of my rides on the right seat, and in the left seat, you might get a tiny pop on the turnaround. But other than that, they kind of feel like wasted elements. It doesn't feel like they serve that much of a purpose. They're not that great at showcasing the speed of the ride because they're so high off the ground, and they don't really have airtime. The airtime that it does have is very, very minimal. It's like if you'd have to be paying attention to notice the airtime, which I was, of course. The laterals on the turnaround are fine. It just doesn't feel like it had a purpose other than just filling out the layout, which is really disappointing because it's been talked to death about how short of a ride experience Orion is. I don't really think it's that short, but when two of the elements are so underwhelming, that is the main problem with Orion, in my opinion. It's not necessarily the duration, it's just that the number of elements, which if you count them out, I count 7. 2 of them are useless, basically. The other 5 are spectacular, as we will discuss, but if the wave turn after the first drop was as well done as the treble clef on Fury, I feel like people would be complaining a lot less about Orion than they do. If Orion had sideways airtime on its first element after the drop, I feel like a lot more people would have walked away from Orion being more satisfied than they were. Even with that lame turnaround, which is fine. You can have a lame turnaround on a ride. Diamondback is my favorite roller coaster of all time, and it has a pretty lame turnaround. I'd argue even the turnaround on Orion is better than the turnaround on Diamondback, but it's still an underwhelming element. Moving on, after that, you have the speed hill, which is just spectacular. Things switch right back into gear. I love the speed hill on Orion. It was my first speed hill on a coaster with clamshell restraints, so my first rides were in the back row, and just feeling how strong the airtime was before the crest, and then after the crest it getting even stronger is just spectacular. Kind of reminds me of Diamondback, how Diamondback does it, but it was a lot stronger. It was fast, it was incredible. I love that element. It's definitely one of the best in the park, if not the best. Speaking of Diamondback, the next element is a Diamondback style floater airtime hill. It does have a trim, but it does not bother me. I feel like the trim did not impact the airtime at all. It's a very solid element, and I love Diamondback, so getting a taste of Diamondback on Orion, I love it. I'll take it. Right after that, you go straight into the Helix, which is really fun. It definitely helps a lot with diversifying forces on Orion. Up to this point, the best parts of the ride were all airtime, and this is a really good part of the ride, which focuses on positive Gs. After that, you curve out, you go under the first drop, and then you curve up into the Twisted Dip. I know this element blew a lot of people away when Orion first opened. That wasn't too surprising to me because the profiling of that element reminds me a lot of the first element on Manta at SeaWorld San Diego. And if you've ridden Manta at SeaWorld San Diego in the back row, you know that that is one of the best airtime moments on the ride. So seeing an element that's profiled just like it on at the end of a Giga coaster, I was expecting a really solid airtime moment, and it did deliver, which is super great. I'm really glad that it does. It's kind of sad that it's more of a standout than the giant wave turn. that thing does kind of upset me by existing, because it has so much potential. It could have been one of the best moments of airtime on the ride, and it's just not. I don't know what happened. I don't know why it's not, because the treble clef is just spectacular. It's one of the best elements I've ever been on Fury 325. It's insane. But here at Kings Island, they got stuck with the wave turn, and it just did not deliver, which is kind of disappointing. It's a little frustrating, but I'm just coming back to the same point. Orion would have been so much more complete if it just had that moment of sideways airtime that just blew everyone away. I feel like it really, really would have tied the whole ride together, but it is what it is. After the Twisted Dip, you pop up into the brake run, and that concludes your ride experience. Overall, I love Orion. It was my first Giga coaster, and I like it more than a couple of them. A couple of the other Giga coasters, which I feel like might be an unpopular opinion. Orion is my type of ride. Even despite the two wasted elements, it is spectacular. It's an incredible ride experience. I love it so much. I rode it 12 times in one day at the end of my trip in 2021, and I love that ride, man. I really, really wish Southern California had a ride like Orion. It is spectacular. It has a great diversity of forces, and I love the airtime it delivers. That type of airtime, we just don't have it in Southern California, so maybe that's why I appreciate it so much. But either way, I love Orion. I love Diamondback. They both deliver. Despite my preference for Diamondback, I still love Orion. In terms of intensity, the two standout moments on this ride were the first valley, the bottom of the first drop. I did gray out on some of my rides, but not all of them. The same applies to the Helix towards the end of the ride. I grayed out on some of my rides, but not all of them. So for whatever reason, my gray outs on Orion were pretty inconsistent. I don't know if that had to do with my hydration levels at the time, or how it was running, but that was just my experience. In terms of rows, I feel Orion is by far a back row ride for that first drop, the Twisted Dip, and the Camelback. But the front is still really good. The sense of speed and the wind in the front row of Gigas, it's spectacular. That's pretty well known. But I feel like it just can't meet the airtime at the back. The only element that might be better in the front row is the speed hill, but even then, it's not by much. It is still a spectacular moment and a standout moment in the back row. However, I actually like Orion better in the front row than I like Diamondback in the front row, so take that for what you will. In terms of ranking Orion's elements, my favorite is the first drop. It is spectacular, it's world class, and I really wish it was closer to my home so I could ride it more. My second favorite element is the speed hill. It's a spectacular moment of airtime. It's one of the best in the park, and I love it, you know. There's not that much to say. And then my third favorite is the twisted dip that reminds me of the first element of Manta. That it's profiled really well, and I love it so much. It's almost like a baby treble clef. That's kind of a stretch, but you know, it's a spectacular moment of airtime and a great way to end the attraction. So I love Orion, and the only way to improve it in my book would be to somehow make that first wave turn give sideways airtime. I don't know what happened. I don't know why it doesn't. I just wish it did, man. That seems to be the bottom line of this review, and that's why I prefer Diamondback over Orion. I mean, it's hard to say in a hypothetical alternate universe if it did give a really solid pop of sideways airtime. Maybe Orion would be my favorite coaster of all time, but it's not. I love Diamondback, and as I outlined in that review, it might be for sentimental reasons, but Orion comes in second at Kings Island for me. That's not really a knock against Orion. I love both of those rides. They're both spectacular, and I really think people need to pay attention to what Orion is and what it does well, and not compare it to Fury and staying low to the ground. And that is not my problem with Orion. I think you can still have a spectacular Giga coaster without doing these low to the ground transitions like Fury and I-305. I actually prefer Orion to I-305, but you know, that's a discussion for another day. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you later.